Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Sebastiaan Faber, and I teach at Oberlin College in Ohio in the United States. The title of my talk today is The Forgotten Legacies of Spanish Civil War Exile, Dispersed, Diverse, Divided. A community hospital in southern France, an archive in a US library, a publishing company in Buenos Aires, a political party in the Dominican Republic, an academic department in Mexico City. If someone were to compile a list, a comprehensive list of cultural and political institutions that were founded or significantly transformed by Spanish Civil War exiles, all these items would have to be included. If that list were to expand to works created, students taught, disciples mentored, or publics reached, it would be nearly infinite. The traces of Spanish Civil War exile are many, and they span the globe. My title suggests somewhat dramatically that these legacies have fallen into oblivion. That is only partially true. For one, they are often recognized or even well regarded in their own cultural and geographic context. It is in Spain itself where they are largely unacknowledged today. Yet even for the Spanish context, the term forgotten is not quite right. After all, many of the exiles' legacies were never remembered or registered in the first place, so they weren't wiped off the map because they never made it onto that map in the first place. My title is misleading in other ways as well. To write Spanish Civil War exile, with exile denoting a singular phenomenon and Spanish Civil War a singular driving force, is clearly too reductive. The truth is that the tens of thousands of Spaniards who left their country in the years following the failed military coup of July 1936 did not all leave for the same reasons. They also had widely diverging experiences once they crossed the border, due in part to the fact that exiles from Republican or Francoist Spain did not all have the same legal status abroad. While some found themselves interned in concentration camps as stateless refugees, for example, others were feted as distinguished guests by foreign governments. Similarly, the options available to them for returning to Spain and the restrictions imposed by the host or home governments varied considerably from case to case as well. For example, the notion of return took on a different meaning for Catalan exiles than for those from elsewhere in Spain. In fact, if it's possible to speak of Spanish War exile in the singular, it's only in a negative sense. The exiles represented everything that Spain, as envisioned by Francisco Franco, was not. Not coincidentally, Franco liked to label them as representatives of an anti-Spain. His regime depicted them as traitors who were not only agents of dangerous un-Spanish ideologies, but could be held directly responsible for the outbreak of the Civil War. Meanwhile, the dictatorship largely managed to exclude the exiles and their work from public life in the Spanish state, particularly during the 40s and 50s, through strict censorship and other forms of control of the public sphere. If exile texts circulated in Franco's Spain during that period, it was almost always clandestinely. The death of Franco in 1975, and then transition to democracy that followed a couple of years later, meant the end of censorship, to be sure, but with some exceptions, no serious attempt was made by the hegemonic forces of the post-Franco Spanish state to recover the exiles and their works, ideas, and accomplishments, however difficult such a project might have been after close to 40 years of displacement. Demonized for years by the regime, they were associated with a chaotic and divisive Republican past that was not thought to be useful or appropriate for the modern, normal European parliamentary monarchy that Spain aspired to be. My goal in what follows is threefold: to sketch the broad outlines of the collective and individual experiences of those who left Spain during or after the War of 36-39, to describe the nature of their legacies, and to explain how and why the significance of those legacies never properly registered in Spain. To counteract the potential reductionism of my title, I will endeavor throughout to underscore the 3 points that I reference in my subtitle. The fact that is that those experiences and legacies were geographically dispersed, socially, politically, and culturally diverse, and marked by deep political divisions. Dispersed, diverse, divided. But first, some basic facts. Historians agree that the outbreak of the large-scale military confrontation in the summer of 1936, a conflict for which, as David Jorge has argued, the term civil war is not really appropriate, and Franco's victory in the spring of 1939 forced some 500,000 citizens of the Spanish state to leave their country. Around the same number is estimated to have died during the war years. Still, it's inaccurate to speak, as some still do, of 500,000 Republican exiles, since many of those who left returned to the country shortly afterwards. In the end, around 160,000 Spaniards, still a considerable number, given that Spain's population at the time was around 26 million, ended up in a form of long-term displacement. These displaced individuals included a good part of Spain's cultural elites: writers, artists, academics, politicians, and other professionals such as doctors, lawyers, architects, and school teachers. These were the same elites that had been instrumental to Spain's so-called Silver Age, La Edad de Plata, which roughly spanned the first 3.5 decades of the 20th century, when Spanish art and literature were at the cutting edge of global modernist movements, while some Spanish scientists and philosophers rose to the top of their fields as well. They were also the same elites that had helped devise and implement the broad reforms of the Second Republic between 1931 and 1936. The non-elite exiles, who were in the majority, included many who identified with activist collectives covering the leftist spectrum that shared versions of these Republican ideals. Driven by a vision of the Spanish state as a modern, secular, just, multinational, and multilingual democracy, the Republican project faced strong opposition from the Catholic Church, the army, and some of the economic elites, including the aristocracy and the other big landowners. All of these had major material and psychological stakes in a very different kind of Spain: imperial, Catholic, traditional, homogeneous, monolingual, and definitely not democratic. Although some exiles left Spain toward the west through Portugal or south through North Africa, many more went north, crossing the Pyrenees. So for most, France was the first point of refuge. The reception was less than hospitable. Most Spaniards were interned in concentration camps, where they suffered hardships and were treated like criminals. Still, France would be the country where most exiles would remain. Yet Mexico, too, received more than 20,000 refugees from Spain. Other countries with significant Spanish Republican exile communities included the United Kingdom, Argentina, the United States, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, and Chile, among many others. This geographical distribution was primarily a function of immigration policies. While France, as the default destination, received the refugees very reluctantly, Mexico was among the few countries voluntarily to open its borders to an almost unlimited number of Spanish Republicans. Now, as noted, people left Spain for different reasons and under different circumstances. Even if it can be said that all exiles disagreed with the Franco regime, that disagreement took different forms. Some exiles were moderate or even conservative liberals. Others identified with radical or revolutionary currents on the left, including anarchism, socialism, and communism, both Stalinist and non-Stalinist. Spaniards' political identities had undergone a high level of variation in the 8 convulsive years from the proclamation of the Second Republic in April 1931 to Franco's declaration of victory in April 1939. The same can be said of their political positions in the years following, which were marked by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the Second World War, and the Cold War, each of which also shaped the nature and international status of both the Franco regime and the Republican government in exile, which officially remained in function until after the dictator's death. Now, this shifting international context at times produced strange bedfellows. Anarchists, for example, who in the war years had clashed with communists over the question of social revolution, which the anarchists wanted to prioritize, while the communists, following partly Stalin's directions, argued that it was more important to win the war for it first. These anarchists sometimes found themselves courted or recruited by the American Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, or one of its sponsored organizations, including the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which were eager to win prominent anti-communists for their cause. The Congress for Cultural Freedom also attracted moderate Spanish liberals and falangistas, who had served the Franco side during the Spanish War, but had become disenchanted with the dictator's abandonment of Italian-style fascism. Similarly, the three principal factions of Spain's Socialist Party, the PSOE, PSOE, continued to bicker in the years following the Republican defeat, to the detriment of the exile's international status and credibility. Now, for some, the experience of the war and displacement intensified the level to which politics dominated their lives. For others, the disappointment of defeat and the frustration of the internal divisions moved them to distance themselves from their political past as much as possible. Yet, for almost everyone involved, politics and exile are closely tied up with questions of national identity. The 3 years of civil war no doubt played a central role here. For one, the war was fought in part over competing visions of Spain, for Spain as a nation. Further, the urgent need for recruitment and persuasion of national and international public opinion had encouraged an intensification of nationalist rhetoric, often with allegorical overtones on both sides. At the same time, the Republican years had also provided a boost to the aspirations of non-Spanish nationalisms within the Spanish state, especially Catalan, Basque, and Galician. For the exiles, desterrats in Spanish and Catalan, literally dislanded, the land from which they'd been uprooted and whose loss they mourned nostalgically was not always necessarily Spain as such. It could also be Catalonia, the Basque Country, Valencia, Galicia, Andalusia, and so forth. The exiles' high levels of dispersion, diversity, and division go some way to explaining why it's been hard for the institutions of post-Franco Spain to do justice to the exiles' legacy. Even at the level of physical archives, for example, the sheer geographical spread from Moscow to Mexico is a logistical challenge. Nor is the lack of interest in the recovery of displaced populations a problem exclusive to Spain. In many ways, the inability to recognize the value of exiles in their work is a typical byproduct of the ways that modern nation states have chosen to tell their cultural histories since at least the 19th century. The prevailing models are still organized along national lines. That is, they still privilege cultural producers and works that are seen to exemplify national identity in one of three ways: the creator's birthplace, citizenship, or language, the thematic focus of their work, or the place the creators and their work can be granted in the evolutionary master narrative of national becoming. Given the dominance of this organizing principle, ultimately rooted in German Romanticism, but by now fully assimilated and institutionalized in everything from literary prizes to academic fields, given the dominance of this principle, cultural producers who spend a significant part of their productive lives in exile, outside of their nation, are often condemned to a sort of cultural historical limbo. Once they're expelled from their homeland, they're frequently excluded from the homeland's national histories of literature, art, music, and so forth. Yet for the same reason, they're also unlikely to be incorporated into the master narratives of their place of exile, even if they manage to adapt to the language, the venues, or the artistic idiom of their new surroundings. If those displaced are members of marginalized communities in their own country already, as was the case, for instance, of the Catalan-speaking members of the Spanish diaspora, then these dynamics of exclusion are only exacerbated. On the other hand, precisely because legacies of exile are often hard to capture into existing analytical categories or fields of study, straddling as they do several spaces at once, acknowledging the cultural legacies we can associate with Spanish war exile and their attempts to recover, honor, or reactivate those legacies in Spain and elsewhere necessarily implies questioning or undermining some basic assumptions founding at the foundations of those fields. If Spanish cultural history has had a hard time acknowledging the legacies of exile, it has also had some trouble connecting the Spanish exile experience with those of other victims or opponents of fascism, a difficulty related to the reluctance to associate the Franco regime with the Axis powers that were instrumental in helping Franco win the Civil War. Still, it's hard to deny that the displacement of Spanish Republicans is only one of several large-scale anti-fascist refugee currents from Western and Central Europe in the 30s and 40s. Two features set the Spaniards apart from the bulk of these currents. First, the fact that the Spanish anti-fascists actually had a chance to fight fascism on the battlefield before the outbreak of World War II. And second, that the liberation of 1945 did not extend to Spain. Anticipating the Cold War, the US and Great Britain allowed Franco to remain as dictatorial head of state. And as a result, Spain's Republican government in exile existed, like I said earlier, until 1977. Close to 40 years of Franco's dictatorship left a clear mark on the ways in which the histories of Spanish literature and art were told, or still are told today. Fernando Larraz has argued that the exile's production was not entirely suppressed. Rather, it was manipulated in an even more harmful way, skewing the place and meaning of the exile's lives and work in the national master narratives. As Larraz also points out, however, the nature of the Spanish transition to democracy, which emerged from a negotiated agreement between the Franco regime and the illegal anti-Francoist opposition, translated into a high level of institutional continuity. As a result, the histories of literature, of art, of thought, etc., taught in the schools and universities were not fundamentally revised after Franco's death. And as Larraz writes, many of the Francoists' inertias and cliches were left in place. The exiles, to be sure, had been busy writing alternative histories based on different conceptions of literary history, including the interplay of cultural and political identities and their relationships to different forms of modernity. But as Maripaz Balibrea has shown, those alternative histories and conceptions were also ignored or dismissed by the cultural and political leadership of post-Franco Spain. If nationalism was a defining feature of Franco's view of Spain, and nationalism inspired by an overarching concept of Spain as traditionalist, Catholic, imperial, anti-liberal, and culturally and linguistically homogenous, many of the Republican exiles also were preoccupied with questions of national identity. Now, although the Spanish cultural elites of the 20s and 30s were, if anything, culturally cosmopolitan and politically internationalist, the experiences of the war, the Republican defeat, and the resulting displacement sparked a resurgence of different forms of cultural nationalism and pan-nationalism rooted in 18th and 19th century traditions. This was not unusual for the 30s, when celebrations of national history and identity were expressly encouraged among the global left, especially after the Communist International officially adopted the Popular Front as the basis for its opposition against fascism. Political science has shown us that exile communities often exhibit an intensification of different forms of nationalism. The intense and difficult fight for cultural and political hegemony between exiles and their home regimes is often centered around questions of nation, national loyalty, and national identity. Now, the diversity of the Spanish exile experience was partly a matter of luck and partly one of status. The handful of prominent writers, artists, and academics who found an institutional home in the Mexican Casa de España, an institution created for that purpose that would later transform itself into the prestigious Colegio de México, were handsomely compensated. They could also teach and publish in a Spanish-speaking environment. The writers and academics who found jobs in the rapidly expanding US system of higher education, on the other hand, did well economically, but often found themselves isolated in cultural, geographic, and linguistic terms. An isolation that in the 60s evolved into a decidedly conservative profile in comparison to other humanities fields, including Latin American studies. Still, many more were much less lucky. Thousands never made it out of the French concentration camps. More than 10,000 were taken prisoner by the Germans after the French capitulation, and thousands ended up in Nazi extermination camps. Many of those who stayed in Europe joined the resistance against the Nazis and liaised with the anti-Francoist struggle in Spain. As is the case with many refugees today, bureaucracy and red tape are the exiles' eternal nightmare. Rejected or persecuted by the Franco government, Spanish Republicans outside of Spain depended on the understanding and goodwill of international agencies and, crucially, other states. This goodwill was scarce. In the wake of the Great Depression, many states around the world had adopted stringent immigration policies that affected not only Jewish refugees from Central Europe, but other anti-fascists looking for asylum as well. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the rise of the modern state and the definition of individuals' rights as a function of their legal status within nation states have allowed governments to punish unwanted individuals and groups with denationalization or simply expulsion, leaving them in practice without rights to speak of. International refugees in the 30s and 40s were all too aware of the fact that their survival depended on the willingness of foreign governments to take them in. This also meant that exiles' place and role in their host societies were often shaped by feelings of gratitude and dependency. The same was true for the various legal restrictions on the activities and rights of refugees, permanent residents, or even naturalized citizens. The US, for instance, applied a restrictive immigration policy as politically active individuals with a progressive or radical profile were often barred from entering, or closely watched or sometimes harassed if they did make it in. Almost 3,000 Spanish children who had been sent to the Soviet Union during the war for safety reasons, with the idea that come back quickly, found that they were not able to go back to Spain after Franco's victory in the beginning of World War II. The close to 2,000 adult Spanish exiles in the USSR who had arrived at the height of the Stalinist purges were often treated with suspicion. The right-wing dictator of the Dominican Republic, meanwhile, gave refuge to some 3,000 Spanish Republicans, despite the fact that they identified with the opposite end of the political spectrum, because he saw them as a welcome economic injection and hoped that they would help, quote, whiten the population. Although many Spaniards were quick to leave the Dominican Republic for friendly environments, they still left a meaningful legacy there, strengthening the opposition against the dictatorship. Now, Mexico, as I suggested above, was much more generous, receiving more than 20,000 refugees from Spain who could count on the sympathy and support of the country's president, Lázaro Cárdenas. Many of them took advantage of and played a central role in the country's cultural and economic flourishing of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, solidified a hegemony that would last until the end of the century, a process in which the Spaniards, by the way, played a strongly supportive role. But the Spaniards' legacy in Mexico extends far beyond politics. Nowhere have Spanish, Catalan, Basque, Galician, and Valencian exiles had a more significant role than in Mexican publishing, philosophy, science, industry, education, art, anthropology, literature, and film. Still, Spanish exiles in Mexico, even those who became citizens of the host country, faced strict rules, including a prohibition to participate in domestic politics. And while there was no language barrier to speak of in Mexico, there was no lack of friction between former colonizers, the Spaniards, and the Mexican former colonized. As if their international legal status wasn't complicated enough, Spanish Republican exile communities were torn by deep internal divisions. As I mentioned, tensions from the Civil War often intensified in reaction to the defeat, leading to personal and collective conflicts that at times led to incidents involving physical violence. To complicate things further, personal and regional feuds and alliances cross-cut political affiliations. The novelist Max Aup, who, like Roberto Gerard, was of mixed background, Jewish, French, German by birth, Spanish Valencian by upbringing, and finally Mexican by exile, illustrates this brilliantly in a short story from 1959, where he ironically portrays some of his fellow Spanish exiles who gather daily in a Mexican cafe. This is what he writes. A socialist who sided with Negrin had to badmouth other socialists if they sided with Largo Caballero or Prieto, and could not be on speaking terms with them, unless they were from the same province. An anarchist of a certain faction could have coffee with someone from the Anarchist Federation, but not with anarchists from any other group, and never, naturally, with a socialist, whomever he sided with and whatever region he was from. Having served in the same army unit could be grounds for friendship or its opposite. Many of the exiles' ongoing internal conflicts reflected political developments in Spain, in their host environments, and worldwide. From the late 40s on, the Cold War decisively shaped Spanish Republican exile experience as Franco pivoted from his Axis-friendly attitude in the first years of World War II, officially Spain was non-belligerent, to a role as the US-friendly anti-communist sentinel of the West. The tactic worked. Spain's international isolation from the immediate post-Civil War years weakened and finally dissolved following a military economic pact with the US in 1953 and admission to the United Nations in late 1955. Exiles who belonged to the Spanish Communist Party, meanwhile, tended to stay faithful to the USSR. On the other hand, as I pointed out, some prominent figures who identified as anarchist liberals or anti-Stalinist communists, including members of the PUM, sided with the West in the Cultural Cold War. For Max Aup, a member of the Socialist Party who was critical of the USSR, but never an anti-communist, the Cold War created what he called a false dilemma that thwarted the development of a third way. Fully aware of the Franco regime's attempts to obliterate the Republican national project in all its diverse embodiments, exiled intellectuals invested large amounts of energy in building the institutional infrastructure to dispute the dictatorship's claim to cultural hegemony. Seneca, a publishing company set up by the poet José Bergamín in Mexico, defied the challenging circumstances of the early years in exile, publishing, among other important books, the complete works of Antonio Machado and the first edition of Federico García Lorca's Poeta en Nueva York. Meanwhile, philosophers such as José Gauss, Eduard Nicol, and Maria Zambrano dedicated their professional work to a critique of modernity from a position of Hispanic cultural specificity, thus partly paving the way for later innovations in Latin American thought. Exiled Spanish academics, whether they worked in the humanities, the social sciences, or natural sciences, often played central roles in the development of their fields in their Latin American host countries. Many also worked as translators, rendering major works of French and German literature, philosophy, and scholarship into Spanish for the first time, in editions that, ironically, were censored in Spain, but helped educate several generations of Latin Americans. In the United States and the UK, the exiles helped strengthen the academic study of Spain. In fact, there are few Spanish departments in the English-speaking world where the influx of Spanish Republican exiles did not leave a decisive mark. When the prolific philologist Américo Castro accepted a professorship at Princeton in 1940, he took advantage of the opportunity to argue forcefully for the relevance of Spanish culture for a world that, he thought, was succumbing to the contradictions of instrumental reason. With the, quote, illusory faith in reason collapsed, he reminded his audience that, quote, any contact with Spanish civilization will pave the way for a new and fruitful humanism, end quote. The dynamic tensions between nationalism and internationalism, which was already evident in the years of the Republican War, proved quite generative in exile as well. Some of the Republican exiles built on the cosmopolitan legacy, including the transnational networks of friends and collaborators of the avant-garde 1920s. Others developed forms of cultural nationalism that included creative reinterpretations of 19th century pan-Hispanism. The poet Juan Larrea, for example, exiled in Mexico, was the driving force behind the Junta de Cultura Española and its journal España Peregrina, the later Cuadernos Americanos, in which he claimed that the defeat of the Spanish Republic in 1939 had inaugurated a new era in which the spirit of the Spanish people, incarnated in the Republican exiles, had moved to the Western Hemisphere in order to save human civilization from the destruction taking place in Europe. In the work of the poet Luis Cernuda, the experience of displacement, first alienatingly in the UK and the United States, and then familiarly, warmly in Mexico, inspired a reinterpretation of Spanish history, including a somewhat glorified reading of the country's imperial past. The exiles who acknowledged and celebrated the linguistic and cultural unity of the Spanish-speaking world did so in a rhetoric that did not always sound terribly different from the explicit neo-imperialism evident in the Franco regime's constant celebration of Hispanidad. Yet, although both forms of Pan-Hispanism shared a common 19th and early 20th century genealogy, the Francoist versions were clearly more reactionary than that of the exiles, who were more bent on rescuing the progressive, liberal, or radical traditions that, in their view, they shared with their Latin American brothers and sisters. Rejecting imperialism on principle, as Republicans, they also tended to connect more with liberal than with conservative traditions in Spain's former colonies, although they could not always stomach or appreciate the celebration of indigenous traditions in countries like Mexico and the concomitant demonization of the Spanish conquistadores. Pan-Hispanism, however, was not embraced by everyone. In many ways, the experience of Spanish speakers different from that of Republican exiles who identified with different linguistic and national traditions within Spain, including, prominently, Catalanes. Mexico, in particular, gave refuge to many prominent Catalan scholars and intellectuals, including the anthropologist Joan Comas, the philosopher Eduard Nicol, and the writers and poets Josep Carné, Vicent Riera Llorca, Agustí Bartra, Lluís Ferran de Pol, Elie Artigenet, and Pere Caldés. Facing a double marginalization, the Catalan exile community set up Catalan language publishing houses and journals that necessarily served very small audiences. Still, the close to 4 decades of displacement saw the publication of some 170 books and dozens of journals in Catalan in Mexico alone. Joan Ramon Resina argued in 2012, it would be a mistake to simply subsume the Catalan exile experience into the broader Spanish narrative. For one, the political and cultural situation of Catalonia during the years of the Republic was quite specific, as it had enjoyed an important level of political recognition 4 decades after the beginning of its cultural renaissance in the late 19th century. This spirit of recognition was followed during the Franco years by a harsh repression of Catalan language, culture, and activism. As a result, Resina argues, Catalan-speaking exiles related very differently, not only to their homeland, but also to the continuing legacies of Hispanic and Hispanist imperialism in Spain's former colonies. If the Spanish-speaking exiles tended to identify, sometimes unwittingly, with the Spanish colonizers, some Catalans preferred to connect more consciously with the colonized indigenous populations, because after all, their language and culture too had faced oppression from an all-powerful Castilian hegemony. Finally, the urge to keep their language, culture, and traditions alive in exile was felt even more intensely by the Catalans, who for that same reason were more eager to return to Catalonia even during the Franco years and even at the cost of some form of internal exile. As I remarked earlier, the cultural legacies of long-term exile pose a wicked challenge to historians of literature, art, or music who are invested in coherent evolutionary narratives organized along neat national lines. While Roberto Gerard was a Catalan composer, for example, can we consider the music he wrote during his long exile, however much it was inspired by his own background, properly Catalan or Spanish? What place, if any, should be assigned to individuals and collectives who left the country and the work they produced outside of its borders. In post-Franco Spain, this question has become an intensely disputed one with clear political overtones. Those who celebrate the Spanish transition to democracy as largely peaceful and successful, for example, have tended to minimize the relative importance of the exile's legacy to Spanish culture today. Scholars who have embraced a more critical view of the transition, on the other hand, have tended to criticize that marginalization, positing the legacies of the exiles as a treasure trove of views and voices whose political and cultural potential has been left largely untapped, to the detriment of post-Franco Spanish democracy, which they characterize as shallow and flawed. These two opposing attitudes come with different normative chronological frameworks as well. The first group likes to portray the exiles as tragically stuck in time with views and ideals that by the 70s had become so anachronistic as to be useless for a Spain that had continued to evolve and modernize even under Franco. For the second group, by contrast, it is the exiles who, dispersed as they were throughout the world, often in more democratic societies, were much more in touch with their time. For them, the exiles' legacies, which include critical takes on forms of modernity dominated by instrumental reason, as well as views and practices steeped in emancipatory traditions like anarchism, socialism, republicanism, federalism, these legacies represent forms of modernity and contemporaneity that were sorely lacking in a Spain dominated by repression and dictatorship, and where Franco had dialed the clock back several centuries. In histories of Spanish literature, even after the transition, exiled authors were often only partially included or left to some kind of an appendix. Histories of Catalan, Basque, and Galician literature, on the other hand, have often granted a more central role to exiles. Since the late 90s, scholars have increasingly emphasized the need to recover the intellectual legacy of Spanish war exiles for democratic Spain, even if they acknowledge the difficulty or even impossibility of such a recovery, in light of the fact that the national paradigm as such is not always fit for such a project. Maripaz Balibrea, in particular, has for years been arguing for the need of recovery, while pointing out that such a recovery can never be total. For her, the untapped and forgotten legacy of the Republican exiles is an important source of alternative models for Spanish democracy, an argument that she lays out in her book, Tiempo de Exilio from 2007. And there she particularly focuses on the work of the novelist Max Aub, the philosopher Maria Zambrano, and the philosopher Eduardo Nicol. For Balibrea, the fact that figures like these can never be completely assimilated into democratic Spain is precisely what makes them so valuable as sources of inspiration and critique of post-Franco democracy. A similar argument structures Daniel Aguirre Oteza's recent book, This Ghostly Poetry, which close reads a handful of canonical exile poets to suggest that some of the poems written in exile, quote, offer a ghostly form of resistance to a teleological model of national literary history, unquote. If Balibrea and Aguirre Oteza resort to the exile legacy in order to question the triumphalist narrative of Spanish democracy or nation-based narratives altogether, the Catalan critic Jordi Gracia does the opposite. For him, the exiles only contributed to Spain's modernization, which he argues was solely initiated by dissident intellectuals under Francoism, only inasmuch as they were willing to nuance, abandon, or betray their loyalty to the Republican cause. If Gracia largely continues to read, interpret, and assess the cultural production of Spanish war exile in relation to the Spanish state, other critics, especially those working outside of Spain, have attempted to turn the difficult relationships between exile and home culture into a lever for rethinking the overall structure of the scholarly fields tasked with studying the culture and history of the Iberian Peninsula and its diasporas. This is actually the central idea behind the ambitious volume Líneas de Fuga, coordinated by Maripaz Balibrea in 2017, which seeks to propose a broad range of alternative approaches. Similar attempts have been made productively under the umbrellas of transatlantic studies, Iberian studies, and transarea studies. All three share the aim to transcend or sidestep accounts of cultural history that privilege the nation state. Instead, they privilege individuals' currents and genealogies that cross cultural and linguistic boundaries. So in this way, transatlantic studies rejects the division of the Spanish-speaking world as an object of analysis into peninsular and Latin American studies, fully recognizing the multicultural and multilinguistic nature of the geographical space that once made up the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Iberian studies rejects the longstanding hegemony of Castilian in the fields that study the cultural production in the Spanish state, viewing Spain and Portugal as multicultural and multinational spaces as well. As we've seen, Spanish Civil War exile communities were also markedly multicultural and multilingual. Transarea studies, for its part, embraces movement, arguing that scholarly approaches to culture that assume a static relationship between place and production, including the traditional philologies, are poorly equipped to explain the literature, art, or music in an era marked by massive displacements, as is ours. Thank you very much.